Good afternoon, everyone. I'm grateful for you tuning in to our devotional. Apologize for last night. We were trying to get that uploaded and finished, and instead we just decided to go with a written form. It was going to be easier and simpler, so we did that. For those of you that took that and used that at your home, I appreciate you taking that and paying attention to that, and certainly hope that it was beneficial to you. It's a study from Esther chapter 6. Last evening, tonight, this afternoon, we go at Esther chapter 7. Before we do, just want to encourage you to look at your 3rd through 6th graders. And I want you to think about them for just a moment. Haven't really done this yet, and we're going to only ask them one question this time. But the reason why I want you to sort of stop just for a minute is I want you to think about the impact that you are having on them in this time of isolation and separation. Ultimately, we may never be in, and I hope we never are, we may never be in this type of situation again where the entirety of your child's formation rests on your shoulders. There is no teacher to help with their education, at least not in the traditional sense. There is no minister in the traditional sense that is preaching to them, or a youth minister or a teacher, a Bible class teacher. You have sort of begun to fill those roles. And while, yes, there are obviously times with these devotionals and our periods of worship and our periods of study where we hope that you are taking advantage of that and using that, but at the same time, you are the one in your home answering the questions. You are the one in your home hopefully reading your Bible with your children, singing songs with your children, spending time in prayer with your children. And so I want you to think about that as perhaps the 3rd through 6th graders are a group that sometimes we just sort of assume that they're kind of picking things up on their own. And in this case, I urge you over the next couple of weeks at least, before we're able to hopefully get back together, I encourage you to seize this moment, seize this opportunity. Ask them questions about what they know concerning the Bible. Ask them questions about what they know concerning what it is to become a Christian. What does that mean? And find out what they have heard and what they think and what they believe, and then study with them. This is a beautiful moment for you as a parent to spend some time in study with your child in an effort to teach them more about God's Word and what it means to obey God's Word and be a Christian, a believer, a child of God. And what a beautiful, beautiful thing that could be. We've seen it happen in this time of isolation, not only in our congregation, but I was just reading earlier today from a fellow minister, a friend of mine that I know, that he was talking about how God is not participating in this quarantine. God is refusing to be boxed in by this quarantine. He is working and doing some amazing things. And in their congregation, this gentleman that I was reading today, in their congregation, they've had 5 baptisms in the past 13 days. And he was talking about how God is obviously moving in the hearts of these young people. And these were all 5 of these were younger people in their either their preteens or their teenage years. And so I just wanted to encourage you as we start our time together this evening. I want you to look them in the eyes, and I want you to think about what it was like for you maybe in those days when you were a 4th, 5th, 6th grader, a 3rd grader, a young person, thinking about what it means to be at church and to worship God and what that even meant to you then. And now think about them, and they are unfortunately unable to do perhaps as you did. They are unable because they're not in the building and they're not with the fellow like-minded Christians like we hoped we could be. So I just wanted to encourage you, and I wanted to challenge you to reach out to them in this time of isolation and just see how far they can grow with just a little bit of attention. It's amazing. It's phenomenal. And I know that you want that for your children, and I just wanted to encourage you because I believe this is a perfect chance and a perfect opportunity for you to have a really incredible impact on your kids. One question, and you can review this with them if they were unable to read this last night from Facebook or the email, or if perhaps you were unable to share this with them last night. then I want you to do that as we begin. What were the three things? I said there last night, we went over Esther chapter 6 and said there's three things, three life lessons that come from Esther 6. What were those three things? Okay, now let's get into our devotional for today. Esther chapter 7. Esther chapter 7 is the watershed moment of the book. Esther 6 gives us sort of the lead up to it. It's Esther requesting from the king that he and Haman come to a meal. And they do, and in that meal, then it's requested by Esther, come to another meal. I want you to come to another feast. And if you remember where we closed last night in the writing was that Haman pretty much determined that, you know what, I must be the top of the line. I must be, honestly, only second to the king. I'm even better than the queen. Honestly, that I am the person. I am the next in line, if you will, to reign over this kingdom. That's obviously the mentality that's coming out of Haman in Esther chapter 6, which leads us then into this chapter 7, and like I said, the watershed moment, the big reveal. The king and Haman went in to feast with Esther, and on the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king again said to Esther, "What is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to half of my kingdom it will be fulfilled." I want to pause just for a moment. I want you to notice just the simple idea, the simple fact that obviously Ahasuerus looks at his queen and thinks, okay, if there's something that you want, you need to tell me. And you can almost sort of read between the lines and picture that Ahasuerus is thinking, you can't just simply want a meal. It can't be just that you want a meal. Now, remember, who we're talking about here? We're talking about Ahasuerus, one who he really does believe in grand gestures to those that he favors. For instance, look at in two opposite directions, obviously, but you look at what for Haman. Haman simply asked for the eradication of people. Haman wanted a group of people killed. It's a simple request, but at the same time, it's simple only in its words. It is complex and dastardly and evil in its execution. And Ahasuerus, because he valued and favored Haman, gives it to him without really even asking any questions. On the flip side of the coin, you have Mordecai, who had done something for the king. He had prevented an assassination attempt. And basically, as we spoke about in the writing last night, he did that not because he wanted the king to acknowledge him, but he did that because it was the right thing to do. And when the king goes back and reads that took place and that nothing was done for him, Ahasuerus immediately says, wait a minute, we need to do something for this man. And he asks Haman, who mistakenly thinks that it's about him, and Haman gives this grand picture of what to do for this individual. And Ahasuerus agrees wholeheartedly. So let's first think about this fact that you're talking about someone who prefers grand gestures. It's what he wants to do. It's what he desires to do. Think about all the way back at the beginning of the book in Esther chapter 1 when he is giving this massive party for these people that he is just moderately connected to. So here he is asking Esther over and over again, really chapters 5, 6, and 7, he asks her, what is it that you wish? What is it that you want? What is it that you wish? What is it that you want? In other words, it can be something bigger than a meal. You want to have this meal with Haman and I, fine, but I really want you to tell me what it is that you actually want. Now, that leads us then into verse 3. Esther has now laid the groundwork, laid the foundation, and now she is going to let the full idea out of the bag. She says, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. Now, if you can, I want you just to pause for just a second, and I want you to try to put yourself in the shoes of Ahasuerus. You have ruled with, for lack of a better term, I know it's cliche, but it's with an iron fist. It has been your way or the highway, again, use a cliche, and ultimately you really don't care about other people. And when you ask, in this case, he's asking his wife, this woman that he has taken to be his wife, he doesn't even really know her, but she found favor in his sight throughout the I guess we would say sort of the tryout period of these other women, it was Esther that got his attention. And because of that, he wants to give her something. And she appeals to an emotionless person on an emotional basis. She appeals to an emotionless person on a level that normally would not even register with this particular individual. But when it comes from her, it is different. But look at how she words it. Verse 4. We have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Now, pause just for a second here. Again, if you remember, those are the exact words of Haman's document. Those are the exact words of Haman's document. When it's been sent to all these different places, he wanted the Jews destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Those are the exact words. It's done in a way that Ahasuerus even probably, there's no way he couldn't have remembered what was written. And I have to believe that he is starting to get the picture. If we had been sold merely as slaves, Esther goes on, men and women, I would have been silent. For our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. Esther is diplomatic and confrontational at the same time, which is sort of odd. It's an odd connection. She's diplomatic in the sense that she appeals to the political mindset of the king, which is, look, I understand. If we were being sold as slaves, that's one thing. That's one discussion we could have. But even then, I wouldn't really say anything because, truthfully, our affliction's not to be compared with the loss to the king. I understand that. But then she is confrontational in the sense that she looks at the injustice being proposed by Haman, and she is challenging Haman. Now, up until this point, Haman has not said a word. He has not tried to disprove this. He is sitting there basically awaiting the other shoe to drop. And it drops. Because Ahasuerus now looks at Esther and he doesn't see just the person fulfilling the throne beside him or the crown or the particular queen's attire. He doesn't see her anymore as just the person fulfilling the role of queen. He now sees her as a person. And that sounds odd, but for Ahasuerus, this is growth. This is now growth. He now sees Esther as a human being, whereas basically for the first 6 chapters, I know he's not necessarily discussed in all 6 chapters, but basically for the first 6 chapters, Ahasuerus has been able to operate as this chauvinistic pig of a human who values no one other than himself. And because of Esther and the way she acted, and because of Esther and the way that she handled herself, she has transformed this one around her. He's not a God follower. He's certainly not a believer or a follower of what God would suggest or God's law, but he now has come from this level of, again, chauvinism and sexism and basically just being an all-around pig to seeing her as a human. And whereas before he probably wouldn't have even cared about what happened to an individual. Even the queen, Vashti, look at her as an example. He kicked her out and didn't even think about her again. Whereas that's who he used to be. Now look at who he is. Who is he? Where is he? And who has dared to do this? Esther said, a foe and enemy. This wicked Haman. There's the second shoe dropping, as it were. And Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. The king arose in his wrath from the wine drinking, went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. Now, this from the you get what you deserve department. Look at verse 8. The king returned from the palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine, as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. And the king said, will he even assault the queen in my presence in my own house? Again, from the department of you get what you deserve. I mean, Haman is going to beg for his life. He's going to beg for forgiveness, for mercy. And when the king turns around, he sees Haman falling upon the couch of Esther, and he says, "Wait a minute, you're trying to attack the queen?" Before those words even really left the mouth of the king, they were already taking Haman captive, as you see there at the end of verse 8. Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, "Moreover, the gallows that Haman has prepared, he's prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king. Those gallows are standing in Haman's house 50 cubits high." And without any hesitation, the king said, "Hang him on that." And I isolated verse 10 for a reason. What a tragedy that this is how Haman's life ends. I mean, he obviously had some ability when it came to the political scene, when it came to a society's sake, I guess you would say. He could not move past his own personal hatred, his own personal bigotry, his personal revenge story. He could not get past that. And because of that, he loses his life. Now, some of us read that, and I have read this for a long time and been grateful for the fact that Haman got what he deserved, so to speak. But I can't help but think now, as I've gone back and studied this story again, just the sadness that comes over me when you think about Haman. And I guess the frustration that comes from, what would Haman have been this person? How would Haman have been had he had someone like Esther in his life? And in a much broader sense, a much more generalized sense, would this terrible tragedy have been avoided had Saul simply done what he was supposed to do in 1 Samuel 15? I don't know. That's all speculation. But that verse, Esther chapter 7, verse 10, is remarkably sad. That's just the best word for it. So what do we learn? What practical lessons do we learn? Well, there's a couple of New Testament passages that I wanted to aim at very briefly here at the end. With Esther, it's Romans chapter 8, verse 28. You know what the verse says, but maybe we've tried to do this before where we've emphasized these particular words, but I want to do it again in this particular study. Verse 28, we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. Again, that word called there, for those who are obedient to God's rules, God's regulations, God's law, God's expectations. Well, certainly that's Esther. She falls into that category, and it doesn't hurt for you to remind yourself of Esther chapter 4 when Mordecai's very conviction of Esther was, who's to say that you weren't called for such a time as this? Who's to say that you weren't put here for such a time as this? Now, was Esther's life perfect? Absolutely not. But again, to emphasize Romans 8:28 there, we know that for those who love God, all things work together. That means the good, the bad, and the ugly. It's for those who love God and those who remain in the light, 1 John chapter 1. Even the things that might be troublesome, even the things that might be stressful, will ultimately lead to God being glorified. Esther's a beautiful picture of that. And then, in the sake of Haman, I just wanted to say this in sort of response to my own sort of heartbreak over his just complete and total destruction, and how that is, it's sad. Like I said, that's the only word I could think. In response to my own feelings that way, I have to think about James chapter 1, verses 14 and 15. Each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. That is Haman in a nutshell. And because of that, verse 15 of James chapter 1, then desire when it is conceived gives birth to sin. Sin when it is fully grown brings forth death. Now we understand that what James is writing about there and the things that happened to Haman are not exactly the same, but there is some similarity and need for discussion there. Was it Haman's sin that caused his death? In this case, yes. But sadder still is the fact that there is a spiritual death that sin can lead to. And for Haman, there was no other opportunity. We've used this example before. For someone like Nebuchadnezzar, he was given time after time after time to get his life right. And when he didn't, finally God sent him out. God put him out with the animals, and he finally came to understand what it meant to be a follower of God and not just a bystander. Well, in the same breath, you have to mention Belshazzar in Daniel chapter 5, who was given one night. We don't know our time. We don't know how much of it we have, and we don't know when our soul will be required of us. And for Haman, it was horrifying. We'll cover Esther chapter 8. And in so doing, you'll find that with Haman, it was too late. It was too late. And over the course of Esther chapter 8, Esther chapter 9, and save Esther chapter 10 because it's very short and it's basically about Mordecai, but you're going to find that the God's plan rolls on with Haman out of the picture. We don't know our time. We don't know when our soul will be required of us. And so it is absolutely necessary that you and I avoid all things that would put us on the pathway that Haman followed. I encourage you today, tonight, when you're studying, when you're looking through these things, look into the eyes of your children. Look into the eyes of your spouse. Consider those within your own family who perhaps are not following the path of righteousness. And determine today that while you have been diplomatic, and you will remain diplomatic in the sense that you are not going to be rude or ugly. The truth cannot be presented in that way, and you can't present it that way and expect people to follow it. Instead, you're going to present the truth in love. And if that needs to be your diplomatic move, then so be it. But you're also going to be confrontational in the sense that you're going to confront what their life could wind up looking like. And sadly, it could end up looking a lot like Haman's. Someone who should have had a better influence on those around him, and unfortunately his life was met with a tragic end. We certainly want that for no one. We want that for no one. We want for people to know Jesus, to know the sacrifice that he made, and that they too, every person is a candidate to obey the gospel, and to then be able to look into the mirror and say, if God is for me, then who can be against me? That's the story of Esther. We'll continue our study Thursday night from Esther chapter 8. Tomorrow night we will be posting a Bible class. I hope that you'll tune in for that at 6:30. And pray that you all have a wonderful evening. And if there's anything we can do for you, please let us know. Hope that you all have a wonderful evening. Look forward to our time of study tomorrow night.